I ended the last lecture by describing for you a mathematical model of competition embodied in what have come to be known as the Lotka-Volterra equations, after the two mathematicians who independently formulated them. You'll recall that these equations represent a modification of the logistic model of population growth, essentially including the population size of a competing species multiplied by what we called a competition coefficient. Now, the principal theoretical conclusion of the Lotka-Volterra equations is that two species that are competing can rarely, if ever, both survive over the long run. In other words, Lotka-Volterra predicts that, except under some very, very special starting conditions, if either of the two species has a slight competitive advantage over the other, then the species that is at a competitive disadvantage will eventually go extinct, while the species with the advantage will essentially take over the whole system. In today's lecture, we're going to pick up on our discussion of competition in communities by looking at some empirical studies of how a competitive interaction affects the abundance and distribution of species. Now, the work of Lotka and Volterra triggered really a number of attempts to study the effects of competition on population growth under controlled conditions in the laboratory. The first and best known of these experiments was done by a Russian ecologist named G.F. Gauss, who did his work in the 1930s. Gauss had recently completed his degree in Moscow, and he began working on laboratory cultures of different species of paramecium to test Lotka and Volterra's theory. Now, in his first experiments, Gauss simulated competition between two species of paramecium called Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. Recall that paramecium are single-celled organisms that we commonly find in any body of fresh water. These organisms can be maintained easily in a test tube in the laboratory, where they prey on bacteria and yeast that in turn grow on decaying plant material, or under more controlled conditions, grow on oatmeal or other kinds of grain that are added to the test tube. As we saw a few lectures ago when we talked about logistic growth, a population of any species of paramecium actually grown in a test tube this way actually will fairly closely follow a logistic growth curve, eventually leveling off at some carrying capacity determined by the resources available in the test tube in which they're living. However, when Gauss added both Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum to the same test tube, he saw something very different. Specifically, Gauss saw that at the start, both species would begin to increase their population size, say over the first few days of the experiment, and in fact start to follow a growth curve that would be predicted by logistic growth. But at some intermediate population size, the population of Paramecium caudatum would begin to decline. In another few days, Paramecium caudatum in the test tube would go down to an extremely small number of individuals, or perhaps even become extinct in the test tube. Meanwhile, the population of Paramecium aurelia would continue to grow, eventually leveling off at its own carrying capacity. In other words, Gauss found that if Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia were grown together, the aurelia won the competition, and the caudatum more or less were wiped out. This result appeared to support the theoretical conclusions of Lotka and Volterra. The two species of paramecium in this case are indeed very similar in their resource needs, and thus we'd expect them to be in competition when they're found in the same environment. But because Paramecium aurelia appears to be the superior competitor, it completely takes over the system after some period of time, and Paramecium caudatum, the inferior competitor, is driven to extinction. Thus, Gauss's work was really the first to demonstrate experimentally that two species with similar needs can't exist in the same place at the same time. Based on his finding, Gauss developed what has become known as the competitive exclusion principle. As Gauss originally formulated it in the early 30s, the competitive exclusion principle simply stated that if two species are competing for the same resource and that resource is limiting, then whichever species is more effective at using that resource will eventually exclude the other species. Competitive exclusion. Following Gauss's work in the 30s, there were actually a large number of studies of different kinds of organisms showing that under controlled conditions in the laboratory, laboratory, the same general result was found. One species would outcompete the other, again suggesting that Lotka and Volterra got it right. But there's a problem here. Based on both experimental evidence and theory, I've just told you that species that are in competition for the same resources can't coexist. But as I told you last time, when we go out into nature, our impression is completely different from this. There seem to be plenty of species that are competing in nature. We commonly see different species using the same resources, such as eating the same kinds of foods, or living in the same places and using the same materials in those places, like similar nesting habitats or areas that they use for other activities, or overlapping in other aspects of their biology that would suggest that they're in competition for some resource. Now, one might argue, based on what we've learned from Lotka and Volterra and from Gauss's experimental studies and the other studies like that, that when we see these kinds of apparently competitive interactions in nature, what we're really seeing is just a transitory state. Maybe a couple of species have gotten thrown together, but give them some time, some months, some years, or some decades, and one is going to win out over the other. In other words, it may be that competition in nature is inherently an unstable state, and that it will always eventually lead to only one species in a community winning out and the other species losing. But in fact, we know this isn't the case from long-term studies of communities in nature. In fact, there are countless examples of natural communities where species are known to share the same resources and are known to maintain stable population sizes over a long period of time. So how can we reconcile Gauss's competitive exclusion principle with the apparent existence of competition in real biological communities? Actually, Gauss himself began to provide an answer to this question. In a subsequent set of experiments, Gauss raised Paramecium caudatum, that was the species that lost out, remember, when it was in competition with Paramecium aurelia, with yet a third species called Paramecium bussaria. Now, Gauss's interest in doing this experiment, I would guess, was actually to ask somewhat of a different question. Gauss wanted to know that if a species that was a loser in one competitive interaction might actually potentially be a winner in another competitive interaction. So he was trying different pairs of species, essentially seeing if he could get a rank order of competitiveness among all of these similar Paramecium species. Based on his earlier work, Gauss predicted that when he put the caudatum in with the bursaria, one of the species would win after a period of time and the other species would lose. Instead, what Gauss found in the case of caudatum and bussaria is that populations of both species increased to some maximum population size and then maintained their population sizes independently. In other words, these two species were able to both undergo logistic growth in the same test tube. This result presented Gauss with a serious puzzle. Why is it that Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium bursaria could coexist, whereas Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia couldn't coexist? Well, the answer to this puzzle came from when Gauss looked at where he found these different species in the test tube. Now, after the population sizes of caudatum and bussaria had stabilized at their respective maxima, Gauss found that the majority of the caudatum were in the upper half of the test tube, whereas the majority of the bussaria were in the lower half of the test tube. It turns out that although the caudatum and bursaria feed on the same sorts of food, they actually prefer to eat slightly different kinds of food. Remember, all of these Paramecium are feeding on bacteria and yeast that are growing in the culture of the test tube. It turns out, though, that the distribution of bacteria and yeast in the test tube isn't uniform. Specifically, yeast need less oxygen to grow well. So in fact, if you look at the distribution of bacteria and yeast in a test tube, you find that there are more bacteria in the upper half of the test tube, closer to the surface where there's more oxygen diffusing into the water, and more yeast lower down in the test tube. Well, Paramecium bursaria is more efficient at eating yeast than Paramecium caudatum, while caudatum is more efficient at eating bacteria. Thus, the fact that the resources in the test tube weren't uniformly distributed, but instead had some structure in space, coupled with the fact that the two species that were in competition in this experiment used those resources in slightly different ways, meant that the two species could coexist. In other words, they weren't in competition throughout the whole space of the test tube that the experiment was being run in. Now, by contrast, the resource use of Paramecium aurelia is virtually identical to that of Paramecium caudanum with respect to the consumption of yeast versus bacteria, which is why those two species couldn't coexist in the same test tube. In other words, the resource use that their pattern of resource use was not different with respect to the structure of those resources in the experimental apparatus. Well, the conclusion reached by Gauss in this second experiment, set of experiments, was simply that species can coexist in competition if their use of resources isn't completely overlapping in space or time. In laboratory experiments like the ones that Gauss conducted in the 30s, it's often the case that species are forced to live or to compete for a single limiting resource that has no spatial structure to it, and therefore they can't coexist. In the real world, however, we rarely find species living in homogeneous environments where they depend on only one critical resource for their survival that occurs in some non-structured way. Instead, in a given habitat, there are many dimensions of structure to that habitat, and the resources available in that habitat also might be structured in different ways and therefore used in different ways by different species. Well, Gauss's competitive exclusion principle, along with the apparent exceptions to this principle that Gauss himself and others identified, eventually led to the concept of what we now call an organism's ecological niche. Now, the idea of an ecological niche embodies the fact that each kind of organism in an ecological community may maximize its survival and reproductive success in a different way, which in turn means it may use resources available in that environment in a different way. Even if they're using similar resources or the same kinds of resources, they may be using them in different ways. Here's a textbook definition of an ecological niche. A textbook definition might go something like, an organism's niche is the sum of all the ways that that organism uses resources in its environment. Another way that a niche is often described in textbooks is that a niche is an organism's ecological role in an environment, or that it refers to the way an organism fits into its environment. A niche can be defined in many ways, not only in terms of the kinds of foods that an organism eats, but also in terms of the way it uses spaces. For example, it could also be defined in terms of something like an optimal temperature range. If it's an aquatic organism like Paramecium, then it may be defined in terms of optimal water chemistry. It may be, if it's a plant, defined in terms of optimal levels of sunlight needed for photosynthesis, or for many animals, optimal conditions under which mating can occur, and so forth and so on. A very influential ecologist of the 20th century, Gene Odom, who spent his career at the University of Georgia, actually, I think, gave what I like as my favorite definition of a niche. He called a niche, or he referred to niches in the following way. He said, if an organism's habitat is its address, then its niche is its occupation. Well, now I have to admit that these various definitions of niches, of an ecological niche, are a little vague. They may seem so, and indeed they are. It's actually very difficult to define an ecological niche rigorously, and it's even more difficult in practice to measure an organism's niche in nature. Well, this is because, in theory, to really know what an organism's niche is, we'd have to know absolutely everything about the biology of that organism. We'd have to know every factor that might affect its reproductive success and its survivorship. And of course, that's hard, if not impossible, to do. Nonetheless, the idea of an ecological niche is a very useful heuristic concept for understanding competition and its effects in communities. Let me give you an example of some work on ecological niches that I think helps illustrate the point behind this concept. This is work that is a classic study done on a group of small songbirds called warblers. Now, we've talked about an example of a warbler species earlier in the course when we were talking about behavioral ecology. You might remember we talked about the prothonotary warbler in terms of the costs and benefits of renesting when it was parasitized by cowbirds. There are actually a whole number of warblers, eastern wood warblers they're called, of many different genera. Today what we're going to talk about is a set of 5 different species in the genus Dendroica. There are actually quite a number of Dendroica species as well. The 5 species that we're interested in, though, are the Cape May warbler, the Blackburnian warbler, the black-throated green warbler, the bay-breasted warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler. If you're a bird watcher, you know these names are wonderful, and they often more or less describe what the bird is colored as. Now, the interesting thing about these 5 species of Dendroica warblers is that they live in a very specific kind of habitat, and they appear to actually eat pretty much exactly the same kind of food. All 5 of these species are insectivorous. They eat small insects by catching them on the wing or gleaning them, and they all spend most of their time in breed in mature coniferous trees in forests of the northeastern United States and down, up into Canada. So it's a very specific habitat, these coniferous forests, and these birds are all found in conifers, and they all appear to eat the same thing. Now, the interesting thing is that these birds are identical in most ways. They're the same size, they're the same shape, their beaks are all shaped the same. In fact, the only difference between these warblers that you can tell is that they have different color patterns for their feathers and they produce different kinds of sounds. But at first glance, if you just go out and ask where do they live and what do they do for a living, as Gene Odom would say, the answer would be the same for all of them. And in fact, for a number of years, these 5 species of warblers were considered a potential exception to the competitive exclusion principle. In other words, these seem to actually be species that have to be in competition. They're virtually identical, if not identical, ecologically, and they all live in the same place. How could they do that? Well, this is where the pioneering work of an ecologist named Robert MacArthur comes into play. MacArthur actually was one of the most influential ecologists of the 20th century. For his doctoral dissertation at Yale, this was just his doctoral dissertation, very influential, MacArthur set out to determine whether these birds actually occupied identical niches. Now, what MacArthur did was in some ways old-fashioned behavioral biology and ornithology. What he did first was go and develop a system for dividing conifer trees into different zones. These zones were defined relative to the height of the tree. For example, you'd have zones that were at the very top versus the middle versus the bottom. They were also defined relative to the center of the tree versus the outside of the tree. So somewhere in the middle of a conifer tree, there would be a zone that would refer to the relatively bare branches in the center as compared to a zone that were the tips of those branches that had many needles out at the edges. Now, the details of how he defined these zones doesn't matter. The point is that he looked at what appeared to be a single uniform habitat and divided it up in an objective way to ask if there was some structure there. MacArthur then went on to conduct a very extensive series of observations of each species, essentially recording where each species spent its time in the tree, what it did specifically when it was spending time there. And he looked at those differences on a very fine scale. Now, after this extensive behavioral study, MacArthur found that the 5 species of warblers were indeed not identical in how they used that tree. They weren't identical in spite of the fact that they had superficial similarities in where they lived and how they seemed to live. Instead, what he found was that each species divided up its time differently in different parts of the tree. For example, the Cape May warbler usually spends its time near the very top of the tree, out in the outside branches where there's a lot of very young green needle growth. By contrast, the bay-breasted warbler usually is found in the middle of the tree nearer the interior where branches are more open. Yellow-rumped warblers are usually found much lower down, sometimes moving up in the center, but largely staying near the base of these conifer trees. MacArthur also found differences in behavior. For example, he found that Cape May warblers tend to catch many of the insects they eat on the wing. They're hawking, they're flying out and catching those insects, whereas other species tend to glean insects off of branches and so forth. Thus, MacArthur's detailed study of these birds revealed that in spite of the fact that they all appear to live in an identical specialized habitat, they really are dividing this habitat in very specific ways. They're doing something that we call resource partitioning. In this way, the warblers are competing for some resources, but each has its own niche, finely defined, but nonetheless distinct. Well, having looked at this example and having looked at the concept of ecological niche, we can go back and restate Gauss's competitive exclusion principle in a slightly different way. We can say that competitive exclusion means that no 2 species can occupy an identical niche. Now, given that the definition of niche is hard to come by, we nonetheless have an operational way of showing how the theoretical work of Lotka and Volterra and the experimental work of Gauss and his many followers can be reconciled with the realities of the more complex partitioning of niches that occur in the real world. Well, now that we've looked at competition and introduced the idea of an ecological niche theoretically, what I want to do is look at a couple of field studies that demonstrate how competitive interactions might affect both the abundance and distribution of species in nature. Let's look first at the question of distribution. And what I want to tell you about is a classic study that was done on the distribution of two species of barnacles. Now, barnacles, as you may know, are encrusting marine invertebrates, right? The larvae of barnacles live free-floating in the sea, and they eventually settle out of the water column and permanently attach themselves to rocks or other structures and become sessile as adults. Now, on the rocky shores of the North Atlantic Ocean, there are two common species of barnacles that occur in the same place, but they usually have completely non-overlapping distributions. One species, Cathamelus stellatus, is found in the higher rocks of these rocky shores in what we'd call the upper intertidal zone. In that same space, you find another species, Balanus balanoides, which is found more specifically on the lower rocks in the lower intertidal zone. Now, we have a pattern here. We have a distribution of these two species of barnacles that seem to segregate themselves literally vertically as to whether they occur in the upper or the lower intertidal zone. There are a couple of reasons that we might see this. One reason could be that the physical conditions in the upper and lower intertidal zone are different enough, and these two species are specialized so that they're only able to live in the higher or lower parts of this intertidal. There are obvious physical differences between these. The upper intertidal zone is exposed to air for a much longer period of time when the tide is out than the lower intertidal zone, right? So desiccation may be more of a problem. And it could be that these species are sorting themselves out based on their adaptations. But it turns out that this doesn't appear to be the case, because you find that the young of both species will settle out across the entire intertidal. It's only after these young have developed in competition for a while that the species eventually sort themselves out. So the alternative hypothesis then is that this distribution difference of these barnacles is because of a competitive interaction. And you can experimentally demonstrate that. How? By the same kinds of experiments we've been doing, or the same kind of experiment that Van Buskirk did. We can remove one species or the other experimentally and see how that affects one distribution or the other. And indeed, when you do that, you find that the removal of one species allows the experimental removal of one species allows the other species to colonize more completely the full range of the intertidal zone. So in the case of these two species of barnacles, we have what appears to be a very strong separation and distribution of these species that is not necessarily due to adaptation differences between these species, although that plays a part in a way I'll tell you in a second, but instead has to do with competitive interactions between these two species. Now, the way adaptation comes into this is simply the fact that one species or the other is better at competing along this distribution, specifically because it's better or less good at resisting desiccation. So just as we saw in Gauss's experiments with Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium bursaria, we get a distribution that has to do with the two species having different competitive advantages in one or the other dimension. Well, now what I want to do is to consider another kind of experiment where we look not at distribution of species and how it's affected by competition, but instead looking at abundance. And this example involves interactions between ants and rodents living in a desert community. Now, ants and rodents in the desert actually both use seeds as a major food resource. You'd think, in general, given that they both eat seeds, that they'd be in competition. But as you also might guess, the ants actually specialize on eating smaller seeds than the rodents, which eat larger seeds. So we expect that they would be in competition, but not necessarily completely in competition. In this case, the resource partitioning is along the dimension of seed size. They can coexist because they don't completely overlap in the resource they use. Nonetheless, there is overlap in the middle, So we would expect, therefore, to see that the population size of ants would be affected by the population size of the rodents and vice versa, because of competition for this resource that's in the middle, the mid-sized seeds. And indeed, this too is exactly what we see. Again, doing experimental manipulations, removals. And these are hard to do, by the way, because you have to go and define an experimental plot in the desert and then either remove all the rodents or remove all the ants. And you can imagine that's quite a chore. But when you do that, if you remove the rodents, the population size of ants increases. In fact, you measure population size in ants not by counting ants, but by counting the number of colonies of these ants. And so the number of colonies of ants will increase in this experimental plot. If you remove the ants, the population size of rodents, which you would infer by trapping these rodents on a regular basis, the population size of rodents increases. Now, this is consistent with the idea that the presence of each species limits the population size of the other species. There's yet another experiment that needs to be done here, though, to confirm this particular interpretation. Because the interpretation here is assuming that the seeds themselves are limited resources. So what you would predict then is that you would have, compared to some control where you have both rodents and ants living, the same density of seeds per unit area if only the ants or only the rodents were there, more or less. In other words, if you have both ants and rodents, they consume the seed resource down to some level below which they can't get it because they can't glean all of the seeds. If you remove the ants, then the rodents are going to take more of those seeds, and it's still going to go down to about the same resource level. But you'd expect the population's carrying capacity of the rodents to go up, and vice versa with the ants. So the way to test this is to have yet another kind of experimental plot where you remove all of the ants and all of the rodents. And you would predict then, if the seeds are the limiting resource, that you would find that the density of seeds in this last experimental manipulation would go up. Because nobody's eating the seeds, or at least the ants and the rodents aren't eating the seeds. And indeed, that's exactly what you find as well, showing that it's competition for seeds that is limiting the population size of the ants and the rodents. Now, there's one more interesting footnote that I have to add to this ant-rodent interaction story, which illustrates that the effects of competition in nature actually can be more complicated than we might think at first. So I told you that if you remove the rodents from an experimental plot, the population size of ants goes up, and it does. But if you wait for a few years, the population size of ants starts to go down again, even though the rodents haven't gotten back into the enclosure. So why is this? Well, this has to do with competition not among ants and rodents, but among the plants that are producing the different sized seeds. You see, because in the absence of rodents, the seeds that are left over tend to be just the very largest seeds. And those largest seeds are produced by different kinds of plants, which just happen to be competitors for the plants, to the plants that are producing the smaller kinds of seeds. So if the rodents fail to eat any of the larger seeds, then the plants producing those seeds become more common in those enclosures and outcompete the plants that are producing the smaller seeds. When the plants producing the smaller seeds are outcompeted, they produce fewer seeds, and the population size of the ants goes down. So what we've seen in this case is that actually, as we saw at first, the presence of rodents does have a direct negative interaction or effect on ant populations through the effect of competition, as we'd imagine. But there's also an indirect positive effect of rodents on ants over the long run, because the rodents are affecting the distribution of the plants producing the seeds. Well, in the last few lectures, what we've been doing is looking at how ecological interactions like predation or competition, can affect the abundance and distribution of the species that we find in a community. Now, the goal here has been to try to explain why we do find certain species in certain numbers in communities. In other words, we're trying to explain something about the abundance and distribution of species relative to the resources available to them in the environment. But it turns out that understanding these kinds of interactions, ecological interactions between specific species or even groups of species, can only take us part of the way there. In order to more completely explain the abundance and distribution of species, we also have to include another very important component to our thinking, and that is we have to consider the environment itself in our analysis. That's what ecosystem ecology is all about, And that's the topic we'll begin to turn to in the next lecture.